September 1st, 1939. Dawn breaks over Poland. The sound of aircraft engines fills the sky. German Stukas dive toward their targets, sirens wailing. On the ground, over 1 million German soldiers pour across the border. World War II has begun. Over the next 6 years, this conflict would consume the entire planet. 60 million people would die. Empires would fall. Cities would be reduced to rubble. The atomic age would be born. And when the smoke finally cleared in 1945, the world would be forever changed. This is the story of the deadliest conflict in human history. A war fought on every continent except Antarctica. A war that began with the ambitions of dictators and ended with mushroom clouds over Japan. This is World War II. To understand World War II, we must go back to 1918, to the end of the First World War. Germany had been defeated. The Treaty of Versailles imposed crushing terms. Germany lost territory, was forced to accept full blame for the war, and had to pay enormous reparations. The German military was reduced to a fraction of its former size. These harsh terms created deep resentment in Germany. Economic chaos followed. By 1923, hyperinflation destroyed the German currency. People carried money in wheelbarrows to buy bread. The savings of the middle class evaporated overnight. Into this chaos stepped Adolf Hitler. Hitler was an Austrian-born veteran of World War I, a failed artist turned political agitator. In 1923, he attempted a coup in Munich. It failed. He was imprisoned. But in prison, he wrote Mein Kampf, his political manifesto. Hitler's message was simple and appealing to a humiliated nation. Germany had been betrayed. The Treaty of Versailles was unjust. Germany deserved to be great again, and he identified scapegoats: Jews, communists, foreign powers. When the Great Depression struck in 1929, Germany was hit particularly hard. Unemployment soared. Democratic institutions seemed powerless. In this environment, extremist parties gained support. In January 1933, Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. Within months, he had dismantled German democracy. Political opponents were arrested or killed. The Nazi Party became the only legal party. Hitler was now dictator of Germany. He immediately began rebuilding the German military in direct violation of the Versailles Treaty. The Western powers, Britain and France, did little to stop him. They were still traumatized by World War I and desperate to avoid another conflict. Hitler tested the limits. In 1936, German troops marched into the Rhineland, German territory that had been demilitarized under Versailles. No one stopped him. In 1938, Germany annexed Austria. Again, no military response from the West. Then came Czechoslovakia. Hitler demanded the Sudetenland, a region with a German-speaking population. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain flew to Munich to negotiate. The result was the Munich Agreement. Britain and France agreed to let Germany take the Sudetenland in exchange for peace. Chamberlain returned to Britain, claiming he had achieved peace for our time. He was wrong. Within 6 months, Germany seized the rest of Czechoslovakia. Meanwhile, in Asia, another aggressor was on the move. Japan had invaded Manchuria in 1931 and launched a full-scale invasion of China in 1937. The Second Sino-Japanese War was already raging when Europe descended into conflict. And in Italy, Benito Mussolini had established a fascist dictatorship. Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1935, testing the League of Nations. The League imposed sanctions, but took no military action. It was clear the international order established after World War I was collapsing. In August 1939, the world was shocked by news from Moscow. Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, supposedly bitter ideological enemies, signed a non-aggression pact. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact included secret protocols dividing Eastern Europe between them. The stage was set. On September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. This time, Britain and France had guaranteed Polish independence. On September 3rd, they declared war on Germany. World War II had begun. The German invasion of Poland introduced the world to a new kind of warfare. Blitzkrieg. Lightning War. Fast-moving armored columns supported by aircraft and motorized infantry smashed through Polish defenses. British and French forces sat behind the Maginot Line, a series of fortifications along the French-German border. There was little fighting. Some hoped the war might still be avoided. They were wrong. On April 9, 1940, Germany invaded Denmark and Norway. Denmark fell in hours. Norway resisted, but was overwhelmed within weeks. Britain sent troops to help, but they were evacuated. Then came May 10, 1940, the day that changed everything. Germany launched Fall Gelb, Case Yellow, the invasion of France and the Low Countries. German forces attacked Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg simultaneously. The French and British armies moved north to meet them, exactly as the Germans had planned. Because the main German thrust came through the Ardennes forest, terrain the French considered impassable for tanks. They were wrong. German armored divisions emerged from the Ardennes and drove toward the English Channel, cutting the Allied armies in two. The speed of the German advance was shocking. The Netherlands surrendered in 5 days. Belgium held out for 18. French and British forces were pushed back to the coast at Dunkirk. Between May 26th and June 4th, over 300,000 Allied soldiers were evacuated from Dunkirk in a desperate operation using military vessels and civilian boats. It was a miracle of improvisation, but they left behind all their heavy equipment. The Germans turned south. On June 14th, German troops entered Paris. The French government fled. On June 22nd, France signed an armistice. In 6 weeks, Germany had conquered France, a feat that had eluded them in 4 years of World War I. Britain now stood alone. Winston Churchill had replaced Chamberlain as Prime Minister. In his first speech, he promised nothing but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. He vowed Britain would never surrender. Hitler expected Britain to negotiate peace. When they didn't, he launched Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain. But first, Germany needed air superiority. The Battle of Britain began in July 1940. The German Luftwaffe attempted to destroy the Royal Air Force. British pilots, many barely in their 20s, fought desperately in the skies over southern England. The battle reached its climax in September. The Germans switched from attacking airfields to bombing London, a decision that gave the RAF time to recover. British pilots, aided by radar technology, inflicted heavy losses on German bombers. By October, Hitler postponed the invasion indefinitely. Britain had survived. It was Germany's first defeat. But the war was spreading. In June 1940, Italy entered the war on Germany's side, hoping for easy gains. Mussolini attacked British forces in North Africa and invaded Greece. Both campaigns failed. German forces had to bail out their Italian allies, sending troops to North Africa under Erwin Rommel and invading Yugoslavia and Greece in April 1941. In the Atlantic, German U-boats hunted Allied shipping. The Battle of the Atlantic became a deadly game of cat and mouse. Britain depended on supplies from America. If the U-boats could cut that lifeline, Britain would starve. Then came June 22, 1941, the decision that would ultimately doom Nazi Germany. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. It was the largest military invasion in history. Over 3 million German soldiers, supported by Finnish and Romanian forces, attacked along a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Stalin was caught completely off guard, despite numerous warnings. The initial German advance was devastating. Entire Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were killed or captured. The Germans drove deep into Soviet territory. Leningrad was besieged. Kiev fell. By October, German forces were within sight of Moscow. But the Soviet Union didn't collapse. Stalin rallied his people. Soviet factories were relocated east of the Ural Mountains, beyond German reach. Millions of Soviet citizens were mobilized. And then came the Russian winter. In December 1941, as temperatures plunged to -40 degrees, the Germans stalled outside Moscow. Soviet forces counterattacked. For the first time, the German army was forced into a major retreat. And on December 7, 1941, everything changed again. Japanese aircraft attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. In 2 hours, they sank or damaged 18 ships and killed over 2,400 Americans. The next day, the United States declared war on Japan. On December 11th, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. The war was now truly global. By early 1942, the Axis powers were at their peak. Germany controlled most of Europe. Japan had conquered much of Southeast Asia and the Pacific. The Allies seemed on the brink of defeat. But beneath the surface, the tide was beginning to turn. In the Pacific, the Japanese advance seemed unstoppable. They had taken the Philippines, Singapore, Burma, the Dutch East Indies. The British Empire suffered its worst military defeat when Singapore fell in February 1942. But in May 1942, the Battle of the Coral Sea stopped the Japanese advance toward Australia. It was the first naval battle fought entirely by aircraft from carriers. Neither fleet saw the other. Then came June 1942, the Battle of Midway. The Japanese planned to lure the American carriers into a trap, but American codebreakers had intercepted their plans. In a battle lasting 3 days, American dive bombers sank 4 Japanese aircraft carriers. Japan lost its offensive capability in a single morning. Midway was the turning point in the Pacific. On the Eastern Front, the Germans launched a new offensive in summer 1942. Their objective was Stalingrad, an industrial city on the Volga River. The Battle of Stalingrad began in August 1942 and lasted 5 months. It was urban warfare at its most brutal. Both sides fought for every building, every street, every room. The city was reduced to rubble. Casualties mounted into the hundreds of thousands. By November, the German Sixth Army had pushed deep into the city. Then the Soviets launched a massive counterattack, Operation Uranus, encircling the entire German force. Hitler ordered the Sixth Army to fight to the last man. They held out through a terrible winter, starving and freezing. On February 2, 1943, the remnants of the Sixth Army surrendered. Of the 300,000 German soldiers encircled, only about 90,000 were still alive to surrender. Only about 5,000 would eventually return to Germany. Stalingrad was the bloodiest battle in history. It was also the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. In North Africa, British and Commonwealth forces under Bernard Montgomery faced Rommel's Afrika Korps. In October 1942, at El Alamein in Egypt, Montgomery attacked. After 12 days of fighting, Rommel retreated. It was Britain's first major land victory. Then, in November 1942, American and British forces landed in Morocco and Algeria, Operation Torch. The Afrika Korps was now caught between 2 Allied armies. By May 1943, all Axis forces in North Africa had surrendered. The Allies now controlled the Mediterranean. In July 1943, Allied forces invaded Sicily. Mussolini was overthrown, and Italy switched sides in September. But German forces occupied most of Italy, and the fighting there would continue until 1945. On the Eastern Front, the Germans attempted one last major offensive. In July 1943, at Kursk, the largest tank battle in history, the Soviets stopped them cold. From then on, the Red Army was on the offensive. They would not stop until they reached Berlin. Meanwhile, the strategic bombing campaign against Germany intensified. British bombers attacked by night. American bombers attacked by day. German cities were devastated. Hamburg, Dresden, Cologne. Dozens of cities were reduced to ruins. Hundreds of thousands of German civilians died. In the Atlantic, the Allies were finally winning the Battle of the Atlantic. Better tactics, more escort ships, long-range aircraft, and ultra-intelligence from breaking German codes allowed Allied convoys to reach Britain. By early 1944, the Allies had air and naval superiority. Germany was slowly being squeezed from all sides. The Soviet Union was advancing from the east. The bombing campaign was destroying German industry, and the Western Allies were preparing for the largest amphibious invasion in history. D-Day was coming. June 6, 1944. Operation Overlord. 156,000 Allied troops landed on 5 beaches in Normandy, France. It was the culmination of years of planning. Thousands of ships, tens of thousands of aircraft, the largest invasion fleet ever assembled. The Germans were caught off balance. Hitler had expected the invasion at Calais, 200 miles to the northeast. Allied deception operations had convinced him Normandy was a diversion. The fighting was brutal, especially at Omaha Beach, where American forces faced withering fire. But by the end of the day, the Allies had established a foothold. Within a week, they had landed over 300,000 troops. The liberation of France had begun. In August, Allied forces broke out of Normandy. Paris was liberated on August 25th. By September, Allied forces had reached the German border. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet summer offensive, Operation Bagration, destroyed German Army Group Center, the single most devastating defeat of the German military in the entire war. Soviet forces liberated Belarus and pushed into Poland. In the Pacific, American forces were island-hopping toward Japan. Saipan, Guam, Peleliu. Each island cost thousands of American lives. The Japanese fought with fanatical determination, rarely surrendering. In October 1944, American forces returned to the Philippines. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history, destroyed what remained of the Japanese fleet. Japan was now cut off from its conquered territories. American submarines were strangling Japanese supply lines. American bombers were beginning to raid the Japanese home islands. By late 1944, Germany's defeat was inevitable, but Hitler refused to surrender. The war would continue into 1945, and millions more would die. January 1945. The Third Reich was collapsing, but the killing continued. On the Western Front, the Germans launched a surprise offensive through the Ardennes in December 1944. The Battle of the Bulge was Hitler's last gamble in the West. Initial German advances created a bulge in the Allied lines, hence the name. But the Americans held at critical points like Bastogne. When the weather cleared, Allied air power devastated the German forces. By the end of January, the Germans had been pushed back. They had lost their last reserves. On the Eastern Front, the Soviets launched a massive offensive in January. They swept across Poland. By the end of January, they were within 100 kilometers of Berlin. As Soviet forces advanced, They liberated the Nazi death camps: Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor. The full horror of the Holocaust was revealed. The Nazis had systematically murdered 6 million Jews and millions of others they deemed undesirable. Gypsies, homosexuals, political opponents, Soviet prisoners of war, Poles, disabled people. The industrial-scale genocide shocked even hardened soldiers. In the West, American and British forces crossed the Rhine in March. German resistance was collapsing. Cities fell in rapid succession. Allied leaders met at Yalta in February 1945. Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin discussed the post-war order. They agreed on the unconditional surrender of Germany, the division of Germany into occupation zones, and Soviet entry into the war against Japan. In April, American and Soviet forces met at the Elbe River in Germany. The Reich was cut in two. Soviet forces surrounded Berlin. On April 16th, they launched the final assault. The Battle of Berlin was brutal. The Germans, including old men and teenagers of the Hitler Youth, fought street by street. On April 30th, with Soviet soldiers blocks away from his bunker, Adolf Hitler committed suicide. His 1,000-year Reich had lasted 12 years. On May 2nd, Berlin surrendered. On May 7th, Germany signed an unconditional surrender. May 8th, 1945, was declared Victory in Europe Day. VE Day. The war in Europe was over, but in Asia, the fighting continued. American forces had taken Iwo Jima in February and March at the cost of 26,000 American casualties. They took Okinawa in April through June. Nearly 50,000 American casualties. Japanese losses were even higher. Virtually every Japanese soldier fought to the death. The planned invasion of Japan itself, Operation Downfall, was expected to cost hundreds of thousands of American lives and millions of Japanese lives. But there was another option: the Manhattan Project. The secret American program to develop an atomic bomb had succeeded. On July 16, 1945, the first atomic bomb was tested in New Mexico. It worked. The new American president, Harry Truman, Roosevelt had died in April, faced a terrible decision: use the atomic bomb and potentially end the war immediately, or invade Japan with massive casualties on both sides. On July 26th, the Allies issued the Potsdam Declaration, demanding Japan's unconditional surrender. Japan refused. On August 6, 1945, an American B-29 bomber, the Enola Gay, dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. The explosion and subsequent firestorm killed about 80,000 people instantly. Tens of thousands more would die from radiation sickness. Japan did not immediately surrender. On August 8th, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria. On August 9th, a second atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, killing about 40,000 people. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a radio broadcast, the first time most Japanese had heard their emperor's voice. The formal surrender was signed on September 2nd, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. World War II was over. The cost of World War II is almost incomprehensible. Between 70 and 85 million people died, approximately 3% of the world's population in 1940. The Soviet Union suffered the most, losing between 20 and 27 million people, both soldiers and civilians. China lost between 15 and 20 million. Germany lost about 7 million. Poland lost 6 million, half of them Jews. Japan lost about 3 million. The United States, protected by two oceans, lost about 420,000, almost all of them military personnel. Entire cities had been destroyed: Dresden, Tokyo, Hamburg, Manila, Warsaw, In Europe, 40 million people were homeless. In Asia, countless millions more. The geopolitical landscape had been completely redrawn. Germany was divided into 4 occupation zones, eventually becoming 2 countries, East and West Germany. Eastern Europe fell under Soviet control. The British and French empires were fatally weakened and would soon collapse. The United States and Soviet Union emerged as superpowers, beginning a Cold War that would last 45 years. The United Nations was created to prevent future wars. The Nuremberg trials held Nazi leaders accountable for war crimes and crimes against humanity. The concept of genocide was defined. International law was strengthened. Japan was occupied by American forces and transformed into a democracy. The atomic age had begun, casting a shadow over all future conflicts. But perhaps the most important legacy was the determination to say, never again. Never again would the world allow aggression to go unchecked. Never again would genocide be tolerated. Never again would totalitarian regimes be allowed to plunge the world into such horror. World War II reshaped the modern world. The borders drawn in 1945 largely remain today. The institutions created after the war, the UN, NATO, the European Union, still shape international relations. The memory of the Holocaust ensures that genocide, when it occurs, cannot be ignored. The generation that fought World War II has been called the greatest generation. They defeated fascism. They rebuilt the world from ruins. They created the longest period of peace and prosperity in European history. Today, few survivors remain. Soon, there will be none. But their story must never be forgotten, because World War II teaches us what happens when democracy fails, when hatred is allowed to flourish, when aggression goes unchecked, and when good people do nothing. It teaches us that freedom is never free, that democracy is fragile, that vigilance is necessary, and that despite humanity's capacity for terrible evil, we also possess the capacity for extraordinary courage, sacrifice, and hope. The Second World War was the defining event of the 20th century. Its echoes still reverberate today, and its lessons remain as relevant as ever. This was World War II,